Hey guys, it's Quinn. In episode 13 of the fundraising series, we're going to be taking a look at the 2016 Netflix documentary 13th. 13th is a documentary that takes a look primarily at our criminal justice system in America, arguing that its historical ties to racial injustice can be traced up to present day. Now, a documentary should be judged on its mechanics and its substance. In looking at the mechanics of this documentary, it is undeniably very well put together. The imagery is powerful, the production quality is very high, and the story that is told, I think, is done very linearly and very organized. I could go on in many of these respects, but I think that the fact that the documentary had an over $1 million budget demonstrates the quality of this production. The rest of this review will be taking a look at the substance of this documentary. To start, based on the subject matter of what's being discussed, it is a very politically charged documentary. However, there's a lot of material in this film which I honestly don't think is discussed much in normal discourse. The natural consequence of this is that, frankly, no matter how much of an expert you are, I think a lot can be learned from watching this documentary. As such, I think there is a broad appeal from wherever you are on the political spectrum to learn more about our nation in watching this documentary. So if we just take a step back for a second, the goal of a documentary is to inform. And based on what I've just described, this documentary does a fantastic job of bringing to light something very important, yet I think is mostly either misunderstood or really not understood at all. Because of this, just right out there, I would highly recommend this documentary. For regardless of your political affiliation, I think there's a lot that can be learned from it. There's the history of criminal justice, African American history, and at a minimum, a perspective that you may not have heard before. I do have an important critique of this documentary, however. I think that there are times when this documentary doesn't make it clear when it's offering its perspective versus when it's just stating a matter of fact on something. So to explain, there's a concept I'm stealing from anthropology, which I think can be applied to documentaries pretty well. The concept is pretty much as follows. In anthropology, which is where you study other cultures, you want to try to make your personal biases clear and understood so that when you report on the culture, other people can interpret your work with the understanding of how you got to the conclusions that you make. For instance, let's do a simple example. Let's say I'm a religious man, and people know that about me. If I then report that I saw a miracle happen, just as an example, people understood that myself as a religious person has interpreted the event in that way. That doesn't mean necessarily that the event that happened was or wasn't a miracle. It's just that's how I personally would see it. In that regard, by making my biases clear as a religious man hypothetically, it allows people to understand how I reached my conclusion and then separate it from the event itself so that we can interpret it in our own right, understanding that lens. Quinn, you're blabbering. I know. So how does this apply to the documentary? Well, this film takes a very clear and strong stand, which, it should. If you're a documentary and you don't do this, then what's the point? But the stand is pretty much that our institutions can be understood through a racial lens. It's a perspective that I think is argued very effectively throughout this documentary. However, there are times when the documentary makes it unclear whether it's sharing its perspective in this regard or whether or not it's relaying undebatable truths that sort of prove this point. The most telling for me was how they state as a matter of record that the 1988 presidential election, it only came down to criminal justice. That was the only thing that really was of matter in it. And the documentary spends a solid portion of time stating this as just a fact. But that is an oversimplification of that election. I can say that confidently. The reason this bothers me is because the documentary sometimes clouds when it's sharing its perspective versus when it's stating an objective truth. In other words, it sometimes doesn't tell us when its biases influence its reporting of the events. This, I think, is unfair to the audience because the material being discussed is something that the mainstream audience, myself included, is largely ignorant of. It's a lot of the first time that we've ever heard a lot of these stories being told. It's like the religious man, for instance, claiming that he saw the miracle versus just explaining the events that he saw. If the audience doesn't know any better, they won't be able to separate the facts from the interpretation, which I think definitely happens sometimes in this documentary. With that criticism aside, however, this documentary really is informative and I think a lot can be learned from it. Although it does mix educated observations with hard number facts at some points, this is largely down to the fact that this documentary really does take a bold stand. Because of this, the documentary deserves a lot of respect and praise, even if it is open up to small critiques because of how the argument itself is structured at some points. Regardless, however, I think it is a significant and worthwhile documentary to watch for its important perspective on the country around us. Look, the entire fundraising series I've been ending videos by saying black, white, left, and right, we're all in this together. The only way as a country we can thrive is if we try to understand as many perspectives as possible. Therefore, by the very nature of the fact that this documentary is clear in a stance, it should be watched and simultaneously learned from and critiqued. Overall, I would highly recommend it, alongside Do the Right Thing, a film which I reviewed last week actually, as a way to contextualize the movement overall that's going on in our country. This video is sponsored by a resident of the Bay Area, California. This channel is committed to giving every American an equal opportunity in this country, which is why all proceeds will be donated to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. If you're interested in sponsoring a future review video, please feel free to fill out the poll in the description below. Thank you for watching, and remember, black, white, left, to right, we're all in this together. I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.